Anastasia's mate. In Anastasia's mate, a knight and rook team up to trap the opposing king between the side of the board on one side and a friendly piece on the other. Often, the queen is first sacrificed along the a-file or h-file to achieve the position. This checkmate gets its name from the novel Anastasia und das Schachspiel by Johann Jacob Wilhelm Heinz. Andersson's mate. In Andersson's mate, named for Adolf Andersson, the rook or queen is supported by a diagonally attacking piece such as a pawn or bishop as it checkmates the opposing king along the 8th rank. Sometimes a distinction is drawn between Andersson's mate, where the rook is supported by a pawn, which itself is supported by another piece, as in the diagram, and Mayot's mate, where the rook is supported by a distant bishop. Arabian mate. In the Arabian mate, the knight and the rook team up to trap the opposing king on a corner of the board. The rook sits on a square adjacent to the king both to prevent escape along the diagonal and to deliver checkmate, while the knight sits 2 squares away diagonally from the king to prevent escape on the square next to the king and to protect the rook. In addition to being among the most common mating patterns, the Arabian mate is also an important topic in the context of history of chess for being mentioned in an ancient Arabic manuscript dating from the 8th century CE. The pattern is also derived from an older form of chess in which the knight and the rook were the 2 most powerful pieces in the game, before chess had migrated to Europe and the queen given its current powers of movement. Back rank mate. The back rank mate occurs when a rook or queen checkmates a king that is blocked in by its own pieces, usually pawns, on the 1st or 8th rank. Balestra mate. The balestra mate involves a queen cutting off the king's escape both diagonally and vertically whilst having a bishop deliver checkmate. Bishop and knight mate. The bishop and knight mate is one of the 4 basic checkmates and occurs when the king works together with a bishop and knight to force the opponent king to the corner of the board. The bishop and knight endgame can be difficult to master. Some positions may require up to 34 moves of perfect play before checkmate can be delivered. Blackburn's mate. Blackburn's mate is named for Joseph Henry Blackburn and is a rare method of checkmating. The checkmate utilizes enemy pieces, typically a rook, and / or the edge of the board, together with a friendly knight, to confine the enemy king's sideways escape, while a friendly bishop pair takes the remaining 2 diagonals off from the enemy king. Threatening Blackburn's mate, which sometimes goes in conjunction with a queen sacrifice, can be used to weaken black's position. Blind swine mate. The blind swine mate pattern's name is attributed to Polish master Dawid Janowski, who referred to doubled rooks on a player's 7th rank as swine. In the book My System, Niemcowicz refers to this type of mate as the 7th rank, absolute. Boden's mate. Boden's mate involves 2 attacking bishops on criss-crossing diagonals delivering checkmate to a king obstructed by friendly pieces, usually a rook and a pawn. Corner mate. The corner mate is a common method of checkmating. It works by confining the king to the corner using a rook or queen with a pawn blocking the final escape square and using a minor piece to engage the checkmate. Damiano's bishop mate. Damiano's bishop mate is a classic method of checkmating. The checkmate utilizes a queen and bishop, where the bishop is used to support the queen and the queen is used to engage the checkmate. The checkmate is named after Pedro Damiano. Damiano's mate. Damiano's mate is a classic method of checkmating and one of the oldest. It works by confining the king with a pawn and using a queen to execute the checkmate. Damiano's mate is often arrived at by first sacrificing a rook on the h-file, then checking the king with the queen on the a-file or h-file, and then moving in for the mate. The checkmate was first published by Pedro Damiano in 1512. In Damiano's publication he failed to place the white king on the board, which resulted in it not being entered into many chess databases due to their rejection of illegal positions. Double bishop mate. The double bishop mate is a classic method of checkmating. It is similar to Boden's mate, but the 2 bishops are placed on parallel diagonals. The escape squares are occupied or controlled by enemy pieces. Double knight mate. The double knight mate usually involves a king being trapped behind a pawn or a group of pawns in front of it and blocked by a piece to the side. The king is then checked by a knight and forced into a position in which it can be checkmated by the other knight. Dovetail mate, Kozio's mate. The dovetail mate is a common method of checkmating, and is also known as Kozio's mate, named after a study by Carlo Cozio, published in 1766. It involves trapping the black king in the pattern shown. It does not matter how the queen is supported, and it does not matter which type black's other two pieces are, so long as neither is an unpinned knight. See also swallow's tail mate. Epaulette mate. The epaulette mate is, in its broadest definition, a checkmate where two parallel retreat squares for a checked king are occupied by its own pieces, preventing its escape. The most common epaulette mate involves the king on its back rank, trapped between two rooks. The perceived visual similarity between the rooks and epaulettes, ornamental shoulder pieces worn on military uniforms, gives the checkmate its name. Greco's mate. Greco's mate is a common method of checkmating. The checkmate is named after the famous Italian checkmate cataloger Gioacchino Greco. It works by using the bishop to contain the black king by use of the black g-pawn, and subsequently using the queen or a rook to checkmate the king by moving it to the edge of the board. Hookmate. The hookmate involves the use of a rook, knight, and pawn along with one enemy pawn to limit the enemy king's escape. The rook is protected by the knight, and the knight is protected by the pawn, while the pawn also attacks one of the enemy king's escape squares. Kill box mate. The kill box mate is a box-shaped checkmate. The checkmate is delivered by a rook with the queen's assistance. The rook is adjacent to the king, while the queen supports the rook, being separated from it by one empty square on the same diagonal as the rook. This forms a 3x3 box shape, inside which the enemy king is trapped. The king could be anywhere on the board, but must have no escape squares available to him due either to being on the edge of the board or to being blocked off by friendly or enemy pieces. King and two bishops mate. The king and two bishops mate is one of the four basic checkmates. It occurs when the king with two bishops force the bare king to the corner of the board to force a possible mate. King and two knights mate. In a two knights endgame, the side with the king and two knights cannot checkmate a bare king by force. This endgame should be a draw if the bare king plays correctly. A mate only occurs if the player with the bare king blunders. In some circumstances, if the side with the bare king instead has a pawn, it is possible to set up this type of checkmate. Ladder mate, lawnmower mate. In the ladder mate, also known as a lawnmower mate, two major pieces, which can be two queens, two rooks or one rook and one queen, work together to push the enemy king to one side of the board. Legal's mate. In legal's mate, two knights and a bishop coordinate to administer checkmate. Alternatively, without a knight on e5, the mate may be delivered by a bishop on g5 or h4. Lolly's mate. Lolly's mate is a common method of checkmating. The checkmate involves infiltrating black's fianchetto position using both a pawn and queen. The queen often gets to the h6 square by means of sacrifices on the h-file. It is named after Guillaume Battista Lolly. Max Lange's mate. Max Lange's mate is a less common method of checkmating. The checkmate is named after Max Lange. It works by using the bishop and queen to checkmate the king. Mayottes mate. Mayottes mate involves the use of a rook attacking the black king supported by a bishop. It often comes about after the black king castles on its king side in a fianchetto position. White usually arrives at this position after a series of sacrifices on the a-file or h-file. It is a type of Anderson's mate and closely resembles the opera mate. The h-file mate is an apt description, but the pattern is properly called Mayottes mate after the German player C.Karl Mayotte, born August 11, 1810, died May 18, 1868, 57 years old. Morphy's mate. Morphy's mate is a common method of checkmating. It was named after Paul Morphy. It works by using the bishop to attack the black king and a rook and black's own pawn to confine it. In many respects it is very similar to the corner mate. Opera mate. The opera mate is a common method of checkmating. It works by attacking an uncastled king on the back rank with a rook using a bishop to protect it. An enemy pawn or a piece other than a knight is used to restrict the enemy king's movement. It is a type of Anderson's mate and closely resembles Mayet's mate. The checkmate was named after its implementation by Paul Morphy in 1858 at a game at the Paris Opera against Duke Karl of Brunswick and Count Isouard. See Opera game. Pawn mate, David and Goliath mate. The pawn mate, also known as the David and Goliath mate, is a common method of checkmating. Although the pawn mate can take many forms, it is characterized generally as a mate in which a pawn is the final attacking piece and where enemy pawns are nearby. Its alternate name is taken from the biblical account of David and Goliath. Pillsbury's mate. Pillsbury's mate is a common method of checkmating and is named for Harry Nelson Pillsbury. It works by attacking the king with the rook while the bishop is cutting off the king. Queen mate. The queen mate is one of the four basic checkmates. It occurs when the side with the king and queen force the bare king to the edge or corner of the board. The queen checkmates the bare king with the support of the allied king. Reedy's mate. Reedy's mate is a famous method of checkmating. The checkmate is named after Richard Reedy, who delivered it in an 11-move game against Savielly Tartakower in 1910 in Vienna. It works by trapping the enemy king with four of its own pieces that are situated on flight squares and then attacking it with a bishop that is protected by a rook or queen. The rook mate is one of the four basic checkmates. It occurs when the side with the king and rook box in the bare king to the corner or edge of the board. The mate is delivered by the rook along the edge rank or file, and escape towards the center of the board is blocked by the king. Smothered mate. Smothered mate is a common method of checkmating. It occurs when a knight checkmates a king that is smothered, surrounded, by his friendly pieces and he has nowhere to move nor is there any way to capture the knight. It is also known as Philidor's legacy after François-André Danican Philidor, though its documentation predates Philidor by several hundred years. Suffocation mate. The suffocation mate is a common method of checkmating. It works by using the knight to attack the enemy king and the bishop to confine the king's escape routes. Swallow's tail mate, Guriton mate. The swallow's tail mate, also known as the Guriton mate, is a common method of checkmating. It works by attacking the enemy king with a queen that is protected by a rook or other piece. The enemy king's own pieces, in this example, rooks, block its means of escape. It resembles the epaulette mate. Triangle mate. The triangle mate involves a queen, supported by a rook on the same file 2 squares away, delivering checkmate to a king that is either at the edge of the board or whose escape is blocked by a piece. The queen, rook, and king together form a triangular shape, hence the name of the mating pattern. Vukovic mate. Vukovic mate is a mate involving a protected rook which delivers checkmate to the king at the edge of the board, while a knight covers the remaining escape squares of the king. The rook is usually protected with either the king or a pawn. Fool's mate. In chess, fool's mate, also known as the two-move checkmate, is the checkmate delivered after the fewest possible moves from the game's starting position. It can be achieved only by black, giving checkmate on the second move with the queen. Fool's mate received its name because it can only occur if white commits an extraordinary blunder. Even among beginners, this checkmate rarely occurs in practice. Scholar's mate. The scholar's mate may be reached by various move orders. In all variations, the basic idea is the same: the queen and bishop combine in a simple mating attack on f7, or f2 if black is performing the mate. Scholar's mate is sometimes referred to as the four-move checkmate, although there are other ways to checkmate in 4 moves.